The pirates of the Golden Age are often imagined as being confined to the Caribbean, but they were more global than often imagined. Besides haunting basically all of the American continent, pirates frequently roamed into Africa and the Indian Ocean. A lesser but still sizable number of them even drifted into East Asia, the Spice Islands, Indochina, and China itself. One of them is even known for being the first Englishman to visit and provide a detailed description of Australia. His name was William Dampier, a buccaneer who had sacked Spanish cities and went on to circumnavigate the world. Australia, or New Holland as they called it, was the most south he ever got. As for the north, he never went farther in Asia than southern Taiwan, then known as Formosa. Formosa, just like you, dear viewer, means beautiful, but in Portuguese. They were the first Europeans to visit the island, naming it Ilha Formosa, beautiful island. Having recently visited Taiwan myself, I can confirm that the island does indeed live up to its name, and the locals often use the name of Formosa for companies, advertisements. I think I saw tea advertisements with the name Formosa. This video is largely an excuse for me to infodump the stuff I learned about the island during my 3-week stay, which isn't too relevant to the history of Caribbean pirates, even if it has a significant and very interesting colonial history, and was visited by Dampier and the buccaneer crew of Captain Reed and the Signet. Having crossed the Pacific Ocean, Dampier, aboard the pirate ship Signet, entered the Philippines, intending to capture Spanish vessels. From thence they sailed to Vietnam, traveling up the coast of China, Guangdong specifically, and then eastwards to the Pescadores. These islands are nowadays called the Penghu Islands, and are part of Taiwan. If you saw my recent video on navigation, you'll know the importance of charts in that aforesaid art, and how pirates were often reliant on a less than qualitative sort. Dampier mentions this problem when describing the Pescadores. He writes how they had no men aboard acquainted with the coasts, and how they were dependent on charts, which only pointed out to us where such and such places or islands were, without giving us any account what harbor, roads or bays there were, or the produce, strength or trade of them. These we were forced to seek after ourselves. Dampier speaks of visiting a large town with a garrison on the easternmost island, presumably referring to the main island. Only a few years prior, it had been conquered by the Manchurian Qing dynasty from the kingdom of Tang Nang, which had ruled southern Formosa after taking it from the Dutch. Though many trading junks operated in the fine harbor, the governor redirected the buccaneers to Macau, where they might find better trade. The governor did, however, give the pirates a generous parting gift: a cow, 2 large hogs, 4 goats, 2 baskets of flour, 20 large cakes of tasty bread, pineapples, and watermelons. Dampier was most impressed by the gifts of liquor: 2 jars of rice liquor called Baiju, or Sam Shu to Dampier. They also received 55 smaller jars of Hokshu, whose real name I was unable to figure out, but Dampier compared it to a dark European beer called Mum, and said that European sailors loved it very much. In Taiwan, I did have both white liquor made from rice and a darker, stronger one made from millet, which might have been similar to the Hokshu. The former one had a very fruity taste, whereas the latter was very unique, savory, kind of like a soy sauce, with a sweet, fruity undertone. It was made in the city of Tai Tung on the east coast, and a traditional liquor of the Amis tribe. A bottle of it was gifted to me by 2 sisters after I bought a bunch of handicrafts from their store, along with 2 bamboo cups, one for me and one for my friend, call him Mickey. We shared the liquor that night with a bunch of our friends at a hostel in Dulan to a mixed reception. Me and Mickey enjoyed it very much, others, sure. Some, not so much. Is it similar to what Dampier had? Maybe. Maybe not. After this brief visit, Dampier and his men proceeded to Formosa itself, but it isn't certain if he actually set foot on the island, or only witnessed it from a distance. He described it as a large island, crossed by the Tropic of Cancer, mountainous and forested. He said that it had formerly been well inhabited by the Chinese, and frequently visited by English merchants, since it housed a very good harbor for securing ships. But after China was conquered by the Manchurians, called Tatars by Dampier, they spoiled the harbor to prevent the rebellious Chinese from fortifying themselves there, and ordered foreign merchants to trade on the mainland instead. Dampier was only able to grasp the aftermath of Formosa's recent and dramatic history. Before the Manchurian conquest, the island had been home to a small kingdom carved out from a Dutch colony, a complicated conglomerate between the European invaders, Chinese pioneers, pirates, and the native peoples, themselves the descendants of ancient colonizers. As described by Dampier, Taiwan is a largely mountainous country, with a subtropical lowland and temperate highlands. These lands were well inhabited by various animals, including monkeys, panthers, boars, and deer. I did see a couple of monkeys up in the mountains, no panthers, perhaps luckily. As for boar and deer, most of the deer were killed off in the 20th century, and the population is nowadays fairly low. I did have some excellent stir-fried deer in Itasao at Sun Moon Lake, and just like boar, it forms a classical staple of the Indigenous diet. Some of the best boar I had was with Mickey at a night market in Kaohsiung, barbecued by a pair of Indigenous brothers. I call them the Boar Brothers, though I do not think I saw any boars in the wild. A friend of ours did see and record a boar befriending a dog, but she's got like 1 million uploads on her Instagram, so I couldn't really be bothered to find it. You will just have to believe me. The indigenous people of Taiwan are Austronesian, who thousands of years ago undertook an epic migration across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and even Madagascar. Those who remained in Taiwan eventually split into multiple language groups, with each of the different tribes being culturally diverse, even if they shared many common characteristics. One of the great pleasures of traveling to Taiwan was talking either to tribal people or to people of mixed tribal Chinese descent, and learning of their stories, both personal and mythological. For example, one of the biggest tribes today is the Amis. The reason they are so big is because they allied with the Japanese during the colonial occupation of Taiwan between 1895 and 1945. That's a nice and convenient number. A lot of tribes were absorbed by the Amis, but they've since been splitting away and re-establishing their own identities. Another one of the tribes is the Sao, hailing from the area in the northern mountains around Sun Moon Lake, nowadays a popular resort. According to legend, the Sao found the lake when pursuing a white deer. They settled on the shorelines owing to the fertile surroundings and the bounties offered by the depths of the lake. However, they are most often symbolized by the owl, stemming from a legend in which a young woman was discovered pregnant, apparently not knowing the father herself. The tribe did not believe the woman. She was driven into exile and turned into an owl. The Sao have since felt shame over the woman's demise and now hold the owl sacred. Killing them is forbidden, and the Sao believe that if you are lost, the owl will always lead the way. Actually, when I was biking around the lake, I did hear an owl at night, and although I was riding on a well-lit road and didn't really need any assistance, I appreciated the gesture. The tribes nowadays make a lot of money from tourism and handicrafts, which is naturally what I spent most of my money on. Textiles are some of their most exquisite handicrafts. I bought this very nice jacket, besides quote-unquote some items for my mother, because the pirate code dictates that you buy extravagant tribal trinkets before your ma. Many of their items have this triangular symbol on them in a repeated pattern, representing the eyes of the ancestors watching over you. Another fine item I bought was this knife. It has a sling attached to it which you can tie around your waist like a sash, and the handle is made from antler. The blade itself is much smaller than the sheath would suggest. He's a shower, not a grower. I've also seen the shape of the blade on swords and machetes, which were on display in an art cafe out of all places, where me and Mickey talked to a couple of Taiwanese aunties to get, tips about other places for handicrafts. But to be honest, I think they were more interested in the pottery than the swords. The tribes were quite different when the Chinese first wrote about them in 1603. Living in small, gender-divided communities, the men were warlike, always exercising and preparing for combat, with the greatest honor being the number of heads you could hang up outside your door. The Chinese accounts of warlike natives were backed up by succeeding writings from the Dutch, who also described the tribes as having rules for warfare, including the tendency to make formal declarations of war before attacking another village. The village was the most common political entity in pre-colonial Taiwan, each encompassing around 2,000 people. There existed some larger political units, most prominent of which being the 16 villages, ruled over by the Prince of Longzhou, as the Dutch called it. The total population seems to have counted around 100,000. The people themselves were recorded by the Chinese as being of grand stature, and this has been attributed to the rich consumption of animal protein, deer specifically. Additionally, deer were used for clothing, armor, weapons, and even bedding. They were absolutely essential to the tribal economy. Some of the natives made their living as traders. During the late Ming period, Chinese merchants from Fujian province traveled to northern Taiwan, acquiring coal, sulfur, gold, and venison for iron and textiles. In the 16th century, Fujianese traders drifted to southern Taiwan, drawn there by the migrating schools of mullet. Starting in 1567, southern Taiwan also became a meeting point between Chinese and Japanese traders, looking to escape the Ming ban on trade with Japan. As the century progressed, more and more Chinese settled among the natives of Taiwan. The households of a market village might have as many as 6 Chinese living in them. But this did not come without its consequences. One visitor named Chen Di felt that this had a corrupting influence on the purity of the natives. And nowadays still there are some Taiwanese people of primarily Chinese descent who consider the natives to have like pure souls and be more like, pure people. Of the Taiwan Peninsula, nowadays Anping in the city of Tainan, the Chinese said it was inhabited by fishermen and pirates. These pirates were primarily of Chinese descent and had appeared as a consequence of the trade prohibitions with Japan. They were first and foremost smugglers engaging in illegal commerce, and were grouped into organizations engaged in protection rackets, extortion, smuggling, and piracy. They competed, often violently, against rival organizations of a similar kind. Some Chinese scholars have called them armed maritime organizations, Haishang Wu Shuang Jichuan, or pirate merchants, Haiku Shangrun. For them, Taiwan was a suitable base. Europeans had been visiting Asia since the 16th century, when the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch established trade connections, outposts, and colonies, primarily in Southeast Asia, though Portugal managed to acquire the Chinese city of Macau. In the early 17th century, they became increasingly interested in the island of Taiwan. What drew the Europeans' attention wasn't a Boer barbecue, fine handicrafts, or beautiful mountains, but silver. In previous videos, I've discussed how the quest for precious metals served as a primer for European colonialism and piracy by proxy. This was largely caused by a shortage of gold and silver in Renaissance Europe, a shortage which was partially caused by China. You see, China was basically an autarky, self-sufficient, so didn't really need to import anything except for silver. Silver was essentially the only trade item Chinese merchants would accept in return for all of their precious items which the Europeans coveted: silk, spices, porcelain. However, most of China's silver came from Japan, and as previously mentioned, Taiwan served as a crucial meeting hub for the Chinese and Japanese traders, both legal and illegal. Therefore, it was the same hunger for silver which drew Spanish colonialism and buccaneering raids against them, which drew the Spanish and Dutch to Taiwan. In order to gain a competitive edge against the Spanish, the Dutchmen established the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or United East India Company, essentially a mega corporation trading in Asia. They were so powerful so as to possess their own army, fleet, and colonies managed entirely by them. In 1622, the Portuguese chased the Dutchmen out of Macau, forcing them to take refuge in the Penghu Islands. The Chinese sent a force to oust them, but a pirate named Li Dun, known to the Europeans as Captain China, mediated between the two forces and helped the Dutch move to nearby Taiwan. They settled in the harbor of Taiwan, the source of the modern name, where they constructed Fort Zeelandia on a small island. Due to silting, it has since joined with mainland Tainan, and the harbor has entirely disappeared. On the face of it, the location seemed like a decent refuge. However, the waters were shallow and difficult to navigate for the deep-drawing European ships. Additionally, it was surrounded by enemies: hostile natives, Japanese merchants, and pirates. The pirates were led by the enigmatic Yan Cixi, whose life and career has been as mythologized and modeled as many of the Western pirates. Born in Japan, he eventually gathered a crew of pirates, including a firearms expert named Deep Mountain Monkey and a strongman named Iron Zhangong, and together they built a pirate nest on the island of Formosa. After Yan Cixi died, he was replaced by Zheng Shailong, alias Nicholas Gaspard. If you're thinking that this name sounds very, European, it's because he had converted to Christianity in Macau, and Nicholas Gaspard was his baptismal name. Gaspard operated under Dutch colors, capturing ships and splitting the loot with his newfound allies. His vessels were built in Western fashion, tall, sturdy, and armed with cannon able to blast the lower Chinese vessels from a distance. On the other hand, he refrained from abusing civilians, especially those from his home country of Nan'an. Indeed, he had cultivated an image as a Robin Hood kind of figure, or G for Japa, and yes, my Chinese does sound like that, and this reputation led to thousands of men joining him. He was soon becoming a problem for the Chinese government, and to resolve this issue, they eventually bestowed him the rank of admiral. The poacher had become a gamekeeper, and patrolled the coastline for pirates. His new status was also beneficial to the Dutch, since it opened up trade opportunities in China proper. However, they feared that he would try to monopolize trade in Taiwan, and by allying themselves with another pirate, Yu-Sheng, destroyed Zheng's fleet during a sneak attack in 1633. Zheng retaliated, defeating a Dutch fleet and forcing them into peace negotiations. By 1637, he had bested Liu-Shang and ended the pirate wars of the China Sea. Private merchants now paid him tribute to earn his protection and the honor of flying his flag. Although he had ambitions of a Chinese colony on Taiwan, it never actually came to pass, at least during his lifetime. With the pirates and with the Chinese dealt with, the Dutch were able to focus on their Japanese rivals. Japan had long been interested in incorporating Taiwan into its burgeoning empire, owing to its prominent position as a trading post with China, but attempts at conquest and diplomacy had failed. Under the energetic leadership of Suetsugu Heisu Masano, the regent of Nagasaki, they attempted to oust the Dutchman. Initially, contact had been friendly, but Dutch hostility, both in the form of trade restrictions, sponsorship of piracy, and piracy themselves, drove the Japanese into more aggressive action. For a while, the Dutch were even completely banned from Japan. This dispute didn't truly end until Suetsugu's death in 1630. 5 years later, Japan entered a state of isolation, forbidding all of its citizens from going abroad. Dutch control of Taiwan had been solidified, at least for now. When the pirates had been pacified and trade reopened with Japan, Batavia, the capital of the Dutch colonies in Asia, sent reinforcements to Taiwan. With Japan now isolated from the island, the tribes were either looking to ally or oppose the Dutch. And in 1635, the Dutch and their Sinkander allies attacked and defeated the most powerful of the villages, Matau. This prompted the rest to seek peace. The Dutch signed treaties with them, referring to their new allies as the United Villages, a reference to the name of their own country, the United Provinces. Representatives were appointed in each village and given an orange flag, a black velvet robe, and a rattan staff with a silver head, bearing the company insignia. By 1636, a Pax Hollandica had been established around the Bay of Taiwan, at least on the face of it. While the Dutch had been distracted, the Spanish had established a colony in northern Taiwan. As aforementioned, one of Spain's primary interests was the acquisition of gold and silver. That is what drew them to Taiwan, specifically to check the advancements of the Dutch and Japanese. Taiwan would also serve as a naval base from which to protect Chinese junks trading with Manila, a Spanish colony. From Manila, a Spanish galleon delivered Asian treasures to Mexico, from whence it was further delivered to Spain itself. The Spanish were also driven by a religious mission. Their Taiwanese colony was largely managed by missionaries, who believed the island to be a stepping stone from which to Christianize China and Japan. The Spanish arrived in 1626, first anchoring a bay they named Santiago, same as the city I'm currently staying in at the time of recording. The bay is now called San Diaojiao. They proceeded to modern Keelung, where they constructed Fort San Salvador, attaching rings to the rocky cliff sides in order for their vessels to safely moor. This early colony was ravaged by disease, starvation, and hostile natives. Chinese trading junks arrived in 27 and 8, allowing for a flow of provisions. The Spanish sold sulfur to the Chinese in return for silk and rice, and in the long term, they hoped to invite Chinese colonists, Christianize them, and let them farm and hunt in return for a tax. And although this never happened, Chinese officials spoke positively about their interactions with the Spanish. There were also some flirtations with Japanese trade, but this was hampered by the regulations of 1635. Dominican missionaries arrived shortly after the colony's founding, and soon became very numerous, even if most of them hoped to eventually go to China or Japan, kinda like tourists today. Most people who visit Taiwan only do so as a holdover on their way to more popular places. The Dominicans built a church and eventually managed to make inroads after befriending a Japanese convert, who had married a local woman in the interior. Even though some of the natives continued harassing the Spanish, a great number of them came down to trade, convert, or even live with the newcomers. Many viewed conversion as a guarantee against Spanish military aggression, even if the Dominicans had a tendency of siding with natives over the conquistadores. The conflict between the Spanish and natives swung back and forth, and orders were finally delivered from Manila in 1636 to abandon the colony. The economy of the Philippines had been declining in the 20s and 30s, and the small colony of Formosa was viewed as an additional and unnecessary burden. It was unable to prevent Dutch harassment of Spanish trade, leaving empty coffers that couldn't spare a penny for trade on the beautiful island. The colonists remained determined, but soon had to retreat to the fort at Geelong, compared by some to a cowpen. With next to no funds, they could not trade with the Chinese. The vicinity became unsafe, and soldiers did not even dare to go on patrol. The civil administration soon got in conflict with the Dominicans, who went so far as to excommunicate the governor. Having heard about the decline of the Spanish colony, the Dutch sent a military expedition in 1641. The Spanish were alerted and prepared defenses, but the Dutch had managed to gather local allies through earlier diplomatic efforts. Outnumbering the Spanish by many times, they sent a letter demanding their surrender. The Spanish governor refused defiantly, saying that he had faced many greater numbers in Flanders and elsewhere, and they need not bother sending such letters. Since the Dutch lacked any artillery, they did not dare siege the fortress, and after burning the village and mocking the defenders, they pulled back. The burning of Kimauri left a powerful message to the natives, in that the Spanish were unable to protect their own possessions. This led more tribes to abandon the Spanish and turn to the Dutch instead. A few weeks later, a Chinese sampan warned the Spanish of an imminent assault. The Dutch counted several hundred compared to the 60 or so Spaniards. And though the Iberians did put up a valiant resistance, they just couldn't repel the landing parties. And after a 4 days bombardment, the walls of the fort were torn down, and the Spanish hoisted a white flag. The survivors were treated well and allowed passage back to Manila. Today, the short Spanish colonial spell is remembered by Fort San Domingo, located in the modern-day Tamsui district of Taipei. Sadly, I did not know of it until after leaving Taiwan, and so had no chance to visit it, at least for now. I do plan on returning to Taiwan, but at the time of writing it is uncertain when I will return to Asia. But should this video perform well, I might make a sequel visiting the Spanish fort and going more in depth into the Spanish colony. Nowadays, only 2% or so of Taiwan's population are indigenous. Whilst this number might be fuddled by a historical tendency of the Taiwanese to deny any partial indigenous ancestry, it is undeniable that the vast majority of the Taiwanese are of mainland Chinese descent. As we've previously seen, this was far from the case in the early 17th century. And even though a handful of fishermen, merchants and pioneers had penetrated into the interior by then, it wasn't until the Dutch colony and their administration that a large-scale Chinese settlement would begin. Without Dutch efforts, modern Taiwan might have looked entirely different. Mainland China, the Fujian province specifically, was full of poor farmers looking for new land to settle. However, colonizing new territories is a dangerous and costly effort. And even though the Ming dynasty had lifted its maritime restrictions in the mid-16th century, they were still far off from sponsoring overseas expeditions. And China has a very long historical tendency to not be interested in the ocean or overseas expansion. Instead, they were more interested in colonizing nearby land territories and, their neighbors, and even just domestically. They just had enough resources and had enough political affairs and expansion opportunities on land. Whereas Europe, on the other hand, was, had a very tight population in a small area, has very rough geographical terrain, so colonialism for Europeans was a way to look abroad to other territories for resources which were more difficult to acquire from other Europeans, domestically. Bit of a rant. So the Dutch, on the other hand, compared to the Chinese, realized how costly it would be to import European settlers. They decided to invite the Chinese instead, providing them security and assistance in setting up rice and sugar agriculture. They gave them free land, tax exemptions, the use of oxen, and other such benefits. Having previously learned about the colonization of Tortuga and Jamaica on this channel, it is interesting to compare Caribbean colonization to the Asian. Basically, no one wanted to move to the Caribbean except for a handful of adventurers with short-term profit incentives. So officials had to import indentured servants. When this proved unreliable and expensive, they were supplanted by African slaves instead, eventually leading to the Caribbean becoming a majority black region. It is also interesting to compare the sugar industry on Taiwan to that of the Caribbean, the latter being reliant on slavery, the former on free Chinese laborers. It was around this time that the Dutch of the New World were switching over from a tobacco economy to a sugar one, though they did this via French and English allies and trade partners, instead of having their own colonies, at least after losing control of Dutch Brazil. If the Dutch would have kept their sugar colony in Taiwan, it is interesting to consider how the history of the product might have transpired, if Asian sugar might have rivaled Caribbean sugar in some or any way. As a side note, the settlers would eat sugar during rice shortages, presumably the sugar shoots. I did try them stir-fried up at Sun Moon Lake. The eating of sugar became such a problem that the Dutch had instituted a law demanding the processing of all produced sugar. At the face of it, native rights were protected from intrusive expansion. The tribes were regarded as feudal vassals of the Dutch state, whereas the Chinese settlers were regarded as citizens. And whenever the Chinese tried to intrude on native lands, the Dutch officials protested. In return, the tribes provided trade and soldiers for the company's war efforts. However, by the late 1630s, the deer population, the primary source of native nutrition, had largely depleted, and much of the hunting had been taken over by the Chinese. By 1638, some of the tribes were poor and depended on subsidies in the form of rice and clothing. When the company began to tax the natives in the mid-1640s, their conditions worsened. To further smear the rosy picture, the partnership between the Dutch and their subjects was far from equal. They dominated politics, with only a few Chinese tradesmen receiving representation in the government. In 1644, the northern Manchurians invaded China and seized Beijing, sparking a long and bitter civil war. Refugees fled to Formosa, but the conflict also led to a decline in trade, and the Dutch had to increase domestic taxes. This decreased the conditions of the farmers, and it wasn't exactly helped by the cessation of subsidies, and soldiers preying on their property under the guise of searching for tax permits. In 1652, several thousand Chinese farmers rose up in rebellion against the Dutch. The company's soldiers and their native allies managed to take out 500 of them in a pitched battle, and in the following campaign, murdered some 4,000 Chinese settlers. The natives were especially eager in taking Chinese heads, no doubt driven by economic rivalry, but also by the generous bounties offered by the Dutch masters, these in the form of colorful Indian textiles called kangans. Furthermore, the Dutch had abolished their tribute raising from the Aboriginals, and they relied instead entirely on Chinese taxes. They also instituted a ceremony in which native delegates could present their issues to the government, securing their influence and helping them check Chinese expansion. In May of 1654, Formosa was struck by a terrible plague of locusts. Devouring entire fields of rice and sugar, their ravenous hunger led to the deaths of natives, Chinese and Dutchmen. The Dutch believed this to be a sign of God's anger, much like the plagues visited upon the Egyptians, and a long bout of penance did nothing to rebate his divine fury. Perhaps some might have anticipated this to be the beginning of the end of Dutch Formosa. Upon seizing Beijing, the Manchu declared themselves the rulers of China, establishing the Qing dynasty that would govern the country up until our modern age. They would face serious opposition until as late as the 1680s, with one of their fiercest opponents being the son of the pirate, Zheng Shailong, Zheng Chenggong. According to legend, Zheng was born on a beach in a thunderstorm, was said to have turned a monstrous sea turtle into an island, vanquished demons, and made wells by striking his sword into the ground. He is still worshipped as a Chinese saint, both on the mainland and in Taiwan. Legends aside, there isn't too much known about him. We do know that he was born in Japan in 1624, before studying in China at a young age. The fall of Beijing brought an end to his academic path, and he and his family pledged allegiance to the pretender emperor, Long Wu. In gratitude, Zheng was promoted and bestowed the name Koxinga, known to the Westerners as Koxinga. His father, the old pirate, betrayed him, but the Manchus deceived him in turn, placing him under permanent house arrest. Koxinga continued the fight. Using his father's maritime empire and Qing incompetence in naval affairs, Zheng was able to pursue a long and slippery resistance against the invaders. He dominated the waves and coastlines, with the mountainous terrain keeping him well defended from the Manchu invaders. However, it also made it difficult for him to recover inland territory, coupled with his enemy's competence on the battlefield. After failing to take the ancient capital of Nanjing, his power crumbled. The Qing began making serious efforts to defend their trade and coastlines, and Zheng began looking for a new position to resume his long-term ambitions. Formosa, being isolated from the sea yet still proximate enough to China, inhabited by an ethnically related people ruled by increasingly despised foreigners, began to look promising. Tensions between Zheng and the company had been growing in the past years. On the surface they were formal. Zheng and his officers had even been treated by Dutch surgeons. But once you slide the curtain aside, there was mutual mistrust and flat-out piracy. Zheng enforced an effective blockade against Dutch Formosa, executing captains carrying foreign goods to trade there. This damaged not only the Formosan economy, but that of the company as a whole. In March of 1660, Zheng assembled an army and a fleet, conscripting fishermen from the nearby Pescadore Islands to act as guides for the assault. Dutch Formosa was currently governed by a Swedish aristocrat named Fredrik Hoyet, described by one of Zheng's allies as a just, good, and intelligent person, loved and praised by all. He is, purportedly, the first Swede to visit China and Japan. Wow, he's literally me. And as soon as he and the council heard of the impending assault, they prepared their defenses. The natives proclaimed their loyalty to the company, but several mistrusted Chinese were detained, and harsh measures implemented against the Chinese settlers, who were regarded as distrustful and potentially loyal to Zheng. A ship was sent to the company capital in Batavia, asking for reinforcements, and they received a fleet of 12 ships led by Jan van der Laan, soon to be nicknamed Jan tegen de Redenan, John against the roadside, or John the Unreasonable. He considered the invasion to be nothing but rumors, and even if they'd attack, he said that half the available garrison could defend the island, since he considered the Chinese to be effeminate men. Zheng himself dismissed any rumors of the invasion, saying that they had been created to confuse his Manchurian enemy, whom he had to focus all of his attention on. He told Koyet not to believe every rumor he received. John the Unreasonable soon returned to Batavia with complaints against Koyet, who was ordered to be replaced. The order came too late. Koxinga had already attacked. In April of 1660, the monsoon winds turned to the south, cutting Formosa off from Batavia. Zheng arrived on the island with a fleet of several hundred junks, carrying thousands of soldiers, and his landing was assisted by the Chinese locals. The Dutch ships remaining were not enough to prevent his entrance into the Bay of Taiwan. 3 ships were dispatched against a detachment of junks on one of the small islands, but they resisted fiercely, and after one of the Dutch ships exploded, the rest had to retreat. 200 musketeers assaulted a group of Chinese soldiers, holding a sandbar at the entrance of the bay. The musketeers were veterans of the Chinese revolt in 1652, when they had defeated a peasant army many times larger. Though they took down a significant number of enemies with 3 volleys of muskets, Zheng's troops did not break formation, and after being pelted with arrows and flanked, the Dutchmen panicked and fled. A third sortie attempting to reinforce nearby Fort Provincia also failed, with Shandong's troops proving too numerous and disciplined. Shandong's biggest weakness was a lack of provisions, and if the Dutch had realized this, they might have destroyed their grain stores or deployed scorched earth. Now it was too late, and with time and hunger against him, he launched a speedy assault. First fell Fort Provincia, its defenders lacking food and water. He marched next on the natives, most of whom surrendered easily. Shandong treated them amicably, hosting diplomatic celebrations akin to those practiced by the Dutch, imitating their patterns of conquest and dominion. Fort Zelandia remained one final bastion, and being a fortress virtually impregnable against Shandong's weak cannon, the Dutch had cause for hope. In spite of the contrary winds, they managed to send a small messenger boat to Batavia, asking for reinforcements. Ironically, it arrived just 2 days after Koyet's replacement had been sent, and the Batavia officials quickly sent a vessel to intercept and recall him. The replacement was to be, replaced by the one who was initially to be replaced. They did not catch up to him, and when he saw the massive fleet of Chinese junks blocking Taiwan, he decided to say fuck it and sailed for Japan instead. What a weeb. Shortly after his departure, Dutch reinforcements arrived in Formosa, consisting of several ships and 700 troops. Together with the besieged troops, they planned a coordinated naval and land assault on Shandong's troops. 2 ships moved behind Zelandia to bombard the enemy, while 400 soldiers would sortie and attack by land. Meanwhile, a small fleet would attack a group of junks anchored in the bay. The plan was executed on September 16, but when the ship set sail, the wind died. A number of galleys rowed out to engage the enemy, but were routed. Without naval support, the land assault failed, and heavy casualties sustained. Things took a turn for the worse when one of the army officers, Hans-Jürgen Radis, defected to the Chinese side. He knew Zelandia like his own pocket, and advised Shandong to assault a weak redoubt on a hill overlooking the fort. From there, he would be able to bombard the defenders directly and conquer the fort. Of course, the Dutch realized that their enemy would be informed of this major weakness, but they lacked the manpower to sally against Shandong's batteries. The redoubt fell the day after the bombardment began. The Formosa Council realized that alles is verloren and opened negotiations with Shandong, leading to their surrender. Owing to a superior position, they were only allowed to keep some money, having to surrender all of their weapons and merchandise. They also gave him a list of Chinese debtors and leaseholders with claims outstanding against them. Once the surrender had been signed, company forces marched out of Fort Zelandia in good order. So ended European rule of Taiwan. Koyet received all of the blame for the fall of Formosa, and was close to being executed, only commuted by a banishment. He wasn't fully pardoned until 1674, when he published a book blaming the colony's fall on the officials in Batavia. However, it is questionable if the company could ever have held out against the superior numbers, resources, and strategic brilliance of Zheng Chenggang. The fall of Formosa served as an example to show how weak European colonialism really was until the mid-18th century, when they were truly able to surpass the rest of the world economically and technologically. Zheng Chenggang established an independent kingdom on the island of Taiwan, but it wasn't to last. The Qing invaded in 1683, led by one of Zheng's former generals, and largely had the colony abandoned, bar a small garrison, as was mentioned by Dampier during his visit shortly thereafter. The Qing maintained a traditional Chinese view that China was an empire of the land, and the ocean something foreign and, ultimately, uninteresting. It was only slowly colonized by Chinese people, eventually turning into the country it is today.
How do you do, scoundrels? Believe it or not, I am a real person and not just some kind of AI-generated monstrosity haunting the interwebs. I wanted to make a little appearance here at the end of the video to talk a bit more about the foreign handicrafts I've so generously shown you throughout the episode. Specifically, if you'd be interested in acquiring some of them off me. This is actually my last recording from home before I'm going on a 2-year circumnavigation of the world. And I'm going to visit a few southern European countries, South America and Asia again. And I'm going to have the ability to buy a lot of these local handcrafted artisan items. Whether it is like the sort of jewelry I got here, which I bought at Sun Moon Lake. This is tiger's eye. This is the yellow one here is like pottery. I forgot the red one, what that is. Clothes like the jacket here. Knives like the you know, like this one, the very nice tribal knife. Or even some like local quirkier items like the this like gourd bottle that I bought from an old artisan in the Shanla province in southern Taiwan. And I do use it as a drinking bottle. There's currently water in it. If these kinds of exotic handcrafted items are of interest to you, please tell me in the comments and I'm gonna work out some sort of system for it. I'll probably announce it in advance what countries I'm going to visit, so that if you want something specific, maybe I can acquire it. For example, I'm gonna visit Istanbul in a couple of months. They have a lot of very cool handicrafts. Last time I was there in January, I bought a rug, some pottery. I'm especially fond of these organic handmade towels. They're very absorbent. Got this bathrobe, very nice. Again, this is the kind of merchandise I want to sell, not like some factory-made, you know, cheap items. So if you want to make it happen together with me, let me know. And if you want to see more videos covering these exotic locations and unknown stories, give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment with your thoughts. Shout out also to all of my channel members, Patreon supporters and PayPal donors. You guys keep the channel afloat. Thank you for watching and I'll see you again soon.